Hi. Thanks so much for putting this together. My name is Cade, uh, and I am the lead designer at Tactical Tech, which is a German-based nonprofit organization. But before we get started, I'd love to show you a video. This is something that I have really enjoyed quite a lot. The talk here today is going to be called Weaponized Design. And yes, I'm going to just switch this video now.
Buddy, tell it.
Whoa. I can't find the song Shake It Took Her.
Say, Alexa.
Alexa, play Digger Digger.
I can't find the song Too Good to Her.
Alexa,
play Sweet Song.
Let him do it.
Alexa, play Digger Digger. Alexa, play Digger Digger.
Bobby, can you tell it to play Wheels?
You want to hear a station for porn detected. Porno ringtone, hot chick, amateur girl, calling
No,
sexy.
no,
Hot pussy, anal dildo, ringtone.
Alexa, stop!
I really love this video. When the veneer of design falls away and this lovely moment, this precious bond between a young family gets sort of shattered, the design decisions fall away and the presentation falls away, and what you're left with is this sort of obscenity-riddled little landmine that explodes in this child's face. I just love this video so much. It's I'm fascinated by moments like this, right? Alexa, stop is such a dystopian thing to say. It's like something that you would say in your sleep, and you wake up in the cold sweat in the middle of the night and say, oh my God, my Alexa is hunting me. I've been fascinated by these kinds of events for the last few years. And so I've been doing for the last 2 years, especially at Tactical Tech, a lot of research into this. And I thought I'd do this live stream today to talk a little bit about some of this work and especially how it relates to designers. And I'm also looking at the live stream today. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You can type a comment in the live chat and I will respond, and I'll address conversation as it comes through. But in the meantime, I'll just run through this presentation, especially how it relates to graphic design and the world of weaponized design. Before we get started, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about my history, because I think it helps to bring some clarity and some structure, some background history into why I think about this and why I'm so fascinated by these moments of where technology kind of fails us, effortlessly fails us. So in 2009, I was studying generative interfaces in Melbourne, Australia. And as part of that research, I was looking into how interfaces can respond to people in real time. And this is sort of at the beginning stages of the iPhone and other smartphone devices, and that's this kind of connectivity. 4G was rolling out worldwide, things like that. And what I was really looking at was like how an interface can sense how you're feeling or what you're doing right now, and respond to that in real time. And of course, this is now an entire field of machine learning. But when I was sort of looking at this was much more basic, right? This is around just trying to see how people use their devices, how they press them, whether they press them in different ways when they're mad or upset or happy. Sort of doing rudimentary scanning, like local scanning of social media accounts to kind of see if you can understand the user's state and respond from an interface perspective. And in this research caught the eye of Apple, and I was offered a WWDC, Worldwide Development Conference scholarship in the early 2000s, in the early 2010s. And I went over there and I sort of got introduced to the world of Silicon Valley and that entire tech rush. And so for the next decade or so, or the next couple of years, I was moving between San Francisco and other parts of the world during the period of the app gold rush. This is where you could make a lot of money in the App Store. The profits were obscene. I all remember the stories of overnight successes. And as a result of that, I was kind of this outsider, this consultant who would come in and work on projects. I also worked on a number of design teams and things like that. And because of that, I sort of never really got into the whole Silicon Valley worldview of things, what we would call today the bubble. But what I noticed is this weird thing was happening. So we would work on these apps, be it for private businesses, new startups, or big corporations that exist that were beginning to get into mobile devices and smart apps and things like that. And what I was seeing was like we were building these tools to bring more and more people's information and interactions into smartphones and the digital world. But at the same time, these leaks were happening, or these accounts were getting hacked, or big data dumps were happening, or there was stories of surveillance and things like that. And because of that, you had this situation where I would be working on a project with a team of designers and engineers, and at the same time as we were making fun of our clients for not having any security, we were getting these briefs that from art directors or creative directors or our clients themselves saying that we should be designing interfaces aesthetically and through user flows that would make them trust the app that they were using, even though at the same time there was this enormous realm of security issues and data leaks and things like that. And that really didn't sit right with me. So in 2013, I left the field. I stopped working as a designer for corporates, and I basically started to. I worked with Open Whisper Systems on Signal. So I prototyped in 2014 Open Whisper Systems, which is a security firm. They produced a version of Signal, and the version 2.0, which was the massive upgrade that you see today, I worked with the team on that to try to experiment with new ways of creating interface designs. So for example, in this screen here, what you see, this is before WhatsApp and Telegram and things like that, in the early stages of WhatsApp, Telegram, and other messaging platforms. What you see here is an attempt to take early information security technologies and turn it into something that is much more cohesive, much more aesthetically clear and sort of more trustworthy, but in a way that traditionally information security wasn't. So you would have historically you would have these systems that were difficult to read or would overwhelm the users. And what we tried to do was create a series of very aesthetically beautiful, but also trustworthy interfaces to sort of push forward this new generation of information security. And in particular, I want to draw attention to some of the setting screens here. In my work, we looked at the setting screen as like a vital part of an application. And in doing that, we used these really strong and bright colors to try to create a sense of understanding when a user was trying to turn on or off settings that would be detrimental to them, or in other words, potentially leak this information. So as you can see here, for example, this mock-up sort of talking a little bit about some of the features that may or may not be included in an eventual version of Signal. This would show you, like, in turning on this feature, you would actually be potentially leaking information. Now, of course, this was a prototype, and this isn't what Signal has today. But ultimately, there was this exploration where we were using aesthetics to try to create or cultivate understandings of trust and distrust within a system. So once I finished on that project, I moved into I got really fascinated by this idea of information security and information security design being how we respond as an industry to these problems around trust and data leakage and things like that. So I got really obsessed with the way in which code is represented aesthetically and how those aesthetics are then used to not just transmit data long distances, but also encode that information in ways that are machine readable. And sometimes people readable in certain contexts, such as with Morse code or QR codes, which are definitely not human readable. And so I got into this idea of combining the aesthetics and the visual execution of machine or coded language with interfaces. And in 2015, I was the creative director of a company called Spider Oak. And SpiderOrc, which was famous for its backup solutions at the time, was featured by, or was listed by Edward Snowden as being a particularly difficult to crack service. The security on it was good enough that he had claimed that the NSA couldn't get into a SpiderOrc backup. So when I say a SpiderOrc backup, I'm talking something that behaves a lot like Dropbox or something like that. But rather than having access to it, such as the NSA, may have with a firm like Dropbox, in SpiderOrc backup, it was quite difficult for anybody to get into that. And so we started experimenting with social apps. The one on the left here is an example where we were taking key exchange, this idea of sending and receiving addresses that you can encrypt information to and send to other people. This idea of reimagining that. So instead of just getting a string or a series of numbers that you would have to compare with your recipient when you're trying to communicate with someone and make sure that those numbers match, and it's quite difficult. Instead, what we did is we paired with Carnegie Mellon University to look at alternate forms of building this kind of trust. And you can kind of see this here on the left with Cloak, which was a social media network that we put together that allowed you to it was like an opt-in Twitter, this idea that you would have a Twitter account or a timeline where you could make posts, but you were completely invisible to the system until you exchanged these cards with other people on the network, and then the two of you could see each other. Or you could just see one person, and you would need to trade two cards, yours and theirs, in order for you to see each other. On the right, you see an app that we built called Semaphore, this idea of using that same kind of concept, but really bringing it into the branding. And this idea was like information security design would save the world. But really, like, that's not what really happened, right? Because while I was doing all of this work, there were still data leaks, and there were still all these issues around not just data leaks, but the ad tech industry was beginning to ramp up, and surveillance capitalism was really taking off. And so I kind of realized that I couldn't just solve this through InfoSec, or we couldn't just solve it through information security, and that in fact, the issues were a lot larger than that. So in 2017, I moved to Berlin and I joined Tactical Tech. And I started research on a concept called Weaponized Design. So what is Weaponized Design? Weaponized design are interfaces and systems that harm users whilst performing entirely within their design. So what do I mean by that? This here is a snap map by Snapchat. And if you haven't used Snapchat before, what it does is it takes your list of contacts that you've added to your Snapchat app, and it tries to, every time they post, there's a small yes or no dialogue when you first sign in, asking if you want to share your location or if they have access to your location. And then every time you snap, it posts where you are located in the world on a snap map. And of course, this feature rolls out in 2017, and it's designed, as you can see here, to show people in various contexts. For example, in every single case here, what you're looking at are people in public spaces, right? So on the west coast of America, you have a group of people at a summer music festival. In Europe, you have people at a metro strike, and then you have someone in Saudi Arabia on holiday, things like that. So this idea, when it was communicated by Snapchat, was to show people when they're in spaces together. But of course, that's not what really happened. When the feature was released, a reporter from The Verge, her name was Cade Diehm, she found one of her friends and managed to track her friend who is Snapchatting all the way to her house. And then for the purposes of writing the article, she found her place on Google Maps, on Google Street View, took a screenshot of that on Google Street View, and then sent it to her friend. And her friend responded with this quote. And what's interesting about this quote is that in the piece, the author describes her friend as somebody who understands what Snapchat is about, and somebody who considered herself to be a power Snapchatter, and yet was caught out by this feature that shared her address unwittingly online. And really what you have here is a situation where in the design team at Snapchat is actually producing a feature where they're actually taking the wide variety of reasons in which people would actually add someone to their Snapchat contact list and distilling it to a single context, which is that my friends and family, people that I trust, are a part of my Snapchat contact list. And of course, if you look at user engagement, actually you find that that's not a really great way of deciding the level of privacy that's required on Snapchat. In these tweets, these are by cam performers, very public cam performers on Twitter and Snapchat. A lot of people, some of the highest engaging users on the platform are actually these performers who perform racy or sexualized content and have followers that number in the hundreds of thousands sometimes. And these people were also caught out. These users didn't understand, didn't realize that these features were being turned on, and exposed their home addresses potentially to hundreds of thousands of people who follow them simply because of their services in this kind of or follow them as sexualized performers. And that puts these people in huge danger, even though they are driving forces on Snapchat. It puts them in huge danger, and it's not what the design team considers. The use case that the design team decided to not design for. Of course, what's even more outrageous about this is that in a subsequent update, Snapchat turned the feature back on, as you can see in these tweets here. Another example of this is with Twitter itself. So here's an example of a Twitter policy that was announced through Twitter Safety in conjunction with the design team, in which they wanted to turn off list notifications. When someone is added to a list, even if you're not following that person, they add you to a list, and you get a push notification saying that you were added to a particular list. And Twitter's idea was that those list notifications can be abused, and so we will prevent you from seeing them if you don't want to see them. But unfortunately, there was this massive outcry because it turns out that people use these lists to get early warning signs for almost like a seismic, like pre-earthquake warning system where someone gets added to a list, that list gets shared with a horde of people online, and the end result is people using those lists to target, like hordes of people using that list to target and harass a certain individual. And so these lists notifications were sort of early warning signals in which people could actually respond and take steps to protect themselves before they would have this onslaught from a target or a group of people. And of course, this feature was so poorly received that it was pulled within an hour of its announcement, which is quite embarrassing for a company that's been around for a decade or more. This was also in 2017. So this is weaponized design. Weaponized design is not dark UX patterns. And there's a key difference here that I want to explain. Dark UX is dark UX is a technique that people use that can be seen as deeply unethical, depending on how serious it is. But it's where you use an interface to funnel people or force them to make a choice that they might not otherwise make, right? And if you look here, what I'm showing is a series of screenshots from the mobile version of Reddit, where you're using a web browser to browse the front page of Reddit for the first time, and it's asking you via a banner nag to open this page in the official Reddit app. When you tap on an individual Reddit post, you can see in the middle screenshot that it asks you to see this post in either the Reddit app or on Safari. And those two choices are kind of switched in this weird way where you would tap this to open it, but when you tap open, you're actually drawn directly into the Reddit official app, which is quite confusing. And that in this case is pushing you to the App Store to download that particular app. And that is an example of a dark UX pattern, right? This is this idea where you encourage or trick a user into making a choice they otherwise wouldn't make. Weaponized design is the opposite of this. Weaponized design, as I said, is interfaces and systems that harm users whilst performing entirely within their design. So now that I've sort of talked a little bit about this definition and the context around how information security fails to prevent this kind of behavior, or this kind of phenomena from happening, I kind of want to talk through some of the ways in which weaponized design happened. But in order to do that, I need to take a step back and look at graphic design and interface design and kind of trace a line between interface design and where that sort of comes from. I just realized that my slides weren't updating, so I'll just jump back. So here are the Reddit slides, I'm sorry. My browser just froze on me, I'm sorry. So we're coming back here. So I just want to quickly say again, right? On these slides here, top left, the Reddit app, where you have this idea of tap an icon, and then it just kind of, it's nagging you in the bottom to open in the Reddit app. In the middle, you have the Reddit posts that you've tapped, and it tries to capture your tap and pushes you towards opening in the Reddit app. And if you tap that, it pushes you to the Reddit app store if you don't have the app installed. So the idea here is to hijack a choice that you want to make and actually try to make that for you instead. I just managed to reset that. That's great. Just check the stream. Awesome. Yeah, that's working. So just to repeat that, dark UX, encouraging or tricking a user into making a choice they wouldn't otherwise make. So let's trace a line between the history of graphic design and how it relates to design today. So as you can see here, this is a pretty iconic piece of graphic design. And I mean, at this point, it's obvious to state, right, that graphic design is a deeply connected part of culture and politics. This is a piece overseen or produced by Emory Douglas, who was the Minister for Culture of the Black Panthers in the 1970s. But this idea here is that graphic design, from Soviet propaganda to meme culture and beyond, is around collecting aesthetics and the medium of transmission or printing and the cultural context of both the pieces that you're working on and the broader social context and the political context of the moment in which you're designing for, collecting those, putting them together, and then executing in a way that has a profound impact. And this is true across all forms of propaganda or politically motivated art and graphic design. And it's extremely striking in the case of political movements, but it's also really striking in the cases of the corporate equivalent to this, right? Which is this idea of campaigns or capitalism for advertising campaigns. So here you see, for example, Volkswagen. This is the first Volkswagen campaign in the 1950s. And this case is really iconic because it kind of, just checking the stream to make sure that works. Yeah, cool. So the capitalist version of this is interesting because in this case, part of the reason why this campaign was so successful, aside from being an outright hit, was that it took the cultural context that had been developed around the Volkswagen Beetle. That was a car that was built by the Third Reich during the Second World War, and was iconic as Hitler himself was seen or posed with them or rode in them and things like that. It took this concept of a car that had been manufactured for the people of an oppressive, aggressive state, and then reimagined it for international audiences. The previous decade that people had been fighting between these two countries, these states had been at war, and then here we are again, just over 10 years later, and buying this car that was previously an icon for fascism. And this piece by Doyle Dane Bernbach, art directed by Helmut Krone, is this really interesting idea of how you can take the cultural context of the United States and their obsession with muscle cars in the 1950s and combine it with this sort of miniaturization, this idea of stepping away from the grandiose nature that the Volkswagen once stood for and kind of combining it to produce a new demand for a type of car and lifestyle that is around reliability and smallness, and in many ways the anti-mechanics car, this idea that it's small and compact, there's no fuss, it runs all the time. And this campaign basically went for the next 20 years in various forms of execution, but it made the Volkswagen Beetle one of the most popular cars of the day. So to relate this to design, of course, interface design itself has a history with graphic design, but it also has a history outside of that, in particular signified by the hiring of a academic by Apple. His name was Donald Norman in 1993. So at this point in time, Apple was putting together a new interaction design team, or they were building on their interaction design efforts. And Donald Norman was this really interesting hire because at the time he was also the associate professor in psychology at the University of California in San Diego. And he was also the founder for the Institute of Cognitive Science. And his hiring was one of many important early computer design pioneers assembled from various different groups, including graphic designers such as Susan Kare, one of my personal favorite artists of the 20th century graphic designers. But his role in particular was really important because he was a user experience architect who was hired at the time in which computers were becoming commodified, personal computers were becoming commodified and very, very close to becoming mass market. The goals had been there for 2 decades, but we're only just now beginning to actually realize these goals. Of course, excuse me. Of course, today, user experience design no longer requires a sociological or behavioral science background, but the origins of his work and his team's work lingers. It's basically a collection on this team of aesthetics, visual communication, branding, and even deep systems information architecture working in concert to define and anticipate the activities of the user through everything from infrastructure conceptualization through to user research. So at the same time, this other book comes out in 2000. This is the next important part for me. It's a book by Steve Krug called Don't Make Me Think. Now, this is a manifesto that declares a dogmatic adherence to cognitive obviousness, and it celebrates frictionless interaction as the ultimate design accomplishment. And this book is really important, not just for its manifesto and its messaging, but also the time, once again, where it comes out, which is that it is launched or published in 2000, which is right around the time of the dot-com crash, at the very peak of the first internet gold rush. And it's when sites with things like Amazon.com and groups like that were still in their infancies and not the behemoths that they are today. And Steve Krug's manifesto is made up of 3 points here. Don't make me think. It doesn't matter how many times I have to click, as long as each click is a mindless, unambiguous choice. And 3, get rid of half the words on each page, then get rid of half of what's left. And what's interesting about this is that a mindless, unambiguous choice is not without cultural, social, and political context. Designers who produce or adapt work for these societies without a conceptual framework repeatedly fail their users as a consequence, because in order to decode a frictionless interface, the cultural context has to be flattened. And of course, as we know, cultural contexts are hugely varied and rely not just on the individual, but also the societies around them. So you have this problematic thing where you take the history of user experience design and then the graphic design history, both of which are rich in cultural context and sociology, and then you combine them together in a way that then is immediately it's combined in a way that these contexts are erased in its execution. And of course, nothing is more dramatic than this. This is a photo I took. It's an ad in the London Tube. It's for a university called Shillington, or an education group called Shillington. And what catches me out about this particular ad is this idea that you can learn design thinking, design theory, programs, UI, UX, and branding in a 3-month full-time course, which is a far cry from the 3 years or 6 years or even 9 years of design study that one might actually do in a university, or even a 6-month boot camp or intensive boot camp. This idea that you can do things in 3 months it has to have sacrifice, and a lot of that sacrifice comes from the cultural context. So with this in mind, with this idea that design has moved from this perspective of embracing cultural context to erasing it, how are the ways in which weaponized design can occur? There's 3. The first is through team apathy and inertia. This is where a design team, through its own inertia or apathy towards certain types of users, has a result that harms the user. This is usually paired actually with algorithms, but not always, and I'll show some examples. If you understand, if you've ever used Facebook before, and you may have seen this, this is the Facebook year in review. And this is an interesting example. Basically, it uses an algorithm to select a photo as a cover photo for your year in review. It puts it in a circle in the center of an image. The image is an illustration that is celebrating the end of the year, and each year is different, and there's also differences. There's a handful of executions every year as well, designed by different people. And it's designed to sort of help you recap this idea of what your year was like on Facebook. And it's a very celebratory, elated, joyful vibe. But as you can see at these 4 examples, clockwise from left, in the top left-hand side is an image of a 9-year-old girl who had died that same year from cancer. It's a featured image. Top right is an urn with someone's relative's ashes in it. In the bottom right-hand side is a house on fire. And in the bottom left-hand side is a image of a golden retriever or Labrador, an elderly dog actually, had been put to sleep that same year. And so what's amazing about this is that in this mixture of design, aesthetics, and algorithmic infrastructure, what you have is these traumatic relivings of deeply distressing experiences set against this like almost sociopathic or indeed callous executions of design. These absurd ways in which you can inflict and help people relive trauma based on the experiences of their year. And in doing so, this is Team Apathy because it's absurd to think that people would have a good year universally. Indeed, the girl who passed away, her father, Erik Maher, is a very famous CSS and front-end engineer, and he wrote about his experience seeing this. He wrote very publicly about her death as well, but he wrote a piece about this as a reaction to seeing this on Facebook. Algorithms are essentially thoughtless. They model certain decision flows, but once you run them, no more thought occurs. To call a person thoughtless is usually considered a slight or an outright insult. And yet we unleash many literally thoughtless processes on our users, on our lives, on ourselves. In creating this year in review app, there wasn't enough thought given to cases like mine or anyone who had had a bad year. The design is for the ideal user, the happy, upbeat, good life user. It doesn't take other use cases into account. Of course, Twitter is an example of apathy too, right? This idea that the initial team built for the ideal user, small messages sent between people who were friends, which grew in scale to cover billions and billions of users, or billions of accounts, should I say, not necessarily users, across the globe from all walks of the political and social spectrum. And as a result, bred this enormous problematic platform of abuse, or automation and falsification of disinformation, all of these kinds of struggles that Twitter has today. And this is despite years of their users begging them to make changes to the interfaces and the way that the application works to give especially power users, often also the targets of these kinds of attacks, or those who feel this kind of stuff acutely. These users begging Twitter to give them tools to respond to stuff. And of course, it's not necessarily just about a design team being unwilling to do something, but also in many cases, it has to do with scale. Once you create something of such magnitude, it's often quite difficult to anticipate the scale even further. And beyond that, even rolling out changes can be problematic and fraught with difficulty. A single change, like an icon switch from a star to a like, or a star to a heart, can take weeks or months to roll out to every user. Indeed, if you look at this, again, another example of Twitter misunderstanding its platform, Twitter historically saw verification as a way of authenticating identity and voice, but it was interpreted for years in Twitter culture as an endorsement or an indicator of someone's elevated importance. Twitter didn't realize this, and of course this caused, again, a huge storm on the platform. But the reality is that at the same time as Twitter is misunderstanding this, at the most asinine level, you had influencers having parties in Los Angeles with a guest list that was basically, do you have a Twitter tick? And if you don't, you're out. If you've got one, you can come in. And that is like, that was well documented. That's not necessarily an edge case, but yet, even though that was the case, Twitter didn't have any idea. The second example that I want to show is conscious weaponization. So this is a little bit more insidious, and I have a couple of examples for you. The first one, of course, again from last year, is this post here by Ryan Freitas. This is the design director from Facebook's newsfeed. And in it, he talks about his team and how they took a design approach to basically refine the Facebook newsfeed to better engage users. The idea of increasing the metrics of engagement, which many design teams are actually, their performance is measured against engagement and attention. And so they made these small changes to the timeline with the goal of keeping people within the Facebook app for a longer period of time. And what they found is that by making these small changes, all of which are documented in this article, they were able to increase the engagement, even though these are tiny little layout changes through through the use of certain kinds of psychological tools and tricks and things like that. They're able to bring people into Facebook longer than they had before. Of course, the irony of this piece is that it comes out in August 15, 2017, and within a few months, the Justice Department is subpoenaing Facebook and actually enters Facebook's headquarters looking for evidence of disinformation and collaboration with disinformation actors through Facebook. And so what you have here is this design team that is designing for engagement at the same time as external forces are also using these platforms and leveraging these kinds of issues. And I'm not saying that there's a collaboration in this case, but I am saying that there's a collaboration in this case. This is a paper put out in 2014 where Facebook's core data science team started to play with this idea of making emotional contagion through social networks. This is the idea where you would study the kinds of content that people would consume and that you could make people sadder or happier based on what you serve them algorithmically and things like that. And so what you had in this case is you have design teams collaborating with the rest of Facebook in order to bring people into their services for longer, whilst at the same time, other teams within the organization are using these in this very, very ethically dubious way to start to really affect people and produce these studies of manipulation. And this is definitely a case where there's a conscious weaponization by a large platform provider such as Facebook. I have another example in particular with Facebook groups that I want to show off. And not Facebook group, YouTube Kids that I want to show off. So what we're seeing here, and this is well documented, again, it's from 2017. What we're seeing here is this kind of crudely made animation that's quite creepy, pushed towards children by YouTube Kids. And why this is interesting is because as we move through these examples, what you're seeing is this highly disturbing content, right? So if we watch some of these examples, what you see are popular characters such as Mickey Mouse, Frozen characters, or even Spider-Man and superheroes. Basically, these anonymous videos came out. They were designed to monetize YouTube Kids, and it's basically just whatever went that was where it went. And so you have these deeply inappropriate, I mean, this is an example where these two baby Mickey and Minnie are drinking beer and then falling over. You'll see in a second that Mickey Mouse actually bleeds as a result of that. These kinds of things were being pushed through YouTube Kids to kind of through this algorithm that YouTube had created around autoplay, right? So the idea is that autoplay would would play, and you would sit kids down with the YouTube Kids app, and then you would start with a regular video, and these videos would then piggyback off the success of this platform and the success of, Disney or other company-produced videos. And then what would happen is through autoplay and through the passive consumption of children using these apps, you would start with these normal videos, and it would end with these kind of deeply inappropriate, sometimes extremely scary videos. And so the reason why this happens is because even though the external force is the weaponizer in this case, there's this need for the design team to have an unlimited amount of content, whilst at the same time increasing engagement. So in this case, the main driving force that produces this kind of work is this idea of algorithmically selecting videos, whilst at the same time producing an autoplay feature that after a few seconds after the end of a video plays the next video straight away. And so you end up with this kind of ungoverned, easily gamified system that allows these kinds of creators of literal nonsense to profit within this system. The third one that I want to talk about is trade-off conflict, and I think this one in particular is of concern in the field of graphic design. But before I get into that, I want to talk about one of the most egregious versions of this, and that is the iCloud photo hack. So in 2014, Apple rolled out iCloud, and as part of that, it rolled out iCloud Photo Backup. And iCloud Photo Backup took every single file that you had ever taken, every single photo you'd ever taken on your device, and uploaded it to the cloud. Whilst at the same time, this was a point in time where they didn't have a strong understanding about information security, and they didn't have things like two-factor authentication already built into the system. And so what happened is that users of 4chan and other groups or other websites managed to get into people's iCloud photo accounts, and they targeted primarily female celebrities, and they got private photos and shared them with people online, leaked it all online. And the problem, of course, here isn't the hack itself. That is not weaponized design. The weaponization comes from the opportunity that was presented in this case, which in this case is this kind of sexless understanding of how people use their devices. Devices for many, because devices are pushed as a personal computing device, they're used by many in all sorts of personal ways. And as a result of that, you have a large number of people use their phones to sext with. And in many cases, these users were not aware. The choice had been made through trade-off to allow these photos to get uploaded. So what would happen is people would want all of their photos backed up, but because the act of choosing which photos to back up is deeply difficult and introduces friction and is not the most delightful, simplest way of using things, you have this situation where users don't have the choice, or the choice is made for them in a specific context. And the trade-off of that is all photos go to the device, and that means that there's a chance that all of these private photos go online without your consent, or without you feeling like you've given consent. Another example is in infrastructure. This is an event that happens earlier this year, actually, where someone went online during the Trump administration's campaign through customs and immigration to start locking up families and separating families of immigrants. And in this case, someone went on LinkedIn and scraped all of the profiles of everybody who works for that government agency, and then put them in a massive data dump and put it on GitHub. And then Microsoft, the owner of GitHub, took that down because they thought that they didn't want to be associated with the legal risk. Following this, there was an effort to move it to decentralized infrastructure, in particular the DAT project. And the problem with this is that in the DAT project, which is a wonderfully versatile and simple to use, very accessible protocol for decentralizing information, that protocol is not designed with privacy in mind. And it means that without privacy on this infrastructure, people assume the legal risk that a centralized service would have. So whereas someone like Microsoft would consider that legal risk too great, or even the physical risk too great, the DAT protocol, by sharing or participating in the share, that risk is assumed not by a giant corporation that has lawyers and security and things like that, but by individuals, many of whom don't understand the risk, And so that risk is decentralized and it becomes deeply problematic. In this case, it didn't lead to something, well, at least it hasn't yet, but it could be quite difficult. The final thing I want to do before we get into solutions is show you one more piece that relates to graphic design.
Okay, so we start a whole new account on Pinterest. We go and we want to learn about food and drink and art and, oh, who knows, what else? Gardening or something, maybe? Recipes. And we sign up. And look at this. This is nice. We get eggs, we get rice, we get balsamic pork chops. And I just want to know one thing. I'm looking for some information on vaccine reactions because I have a kid. I'm going to get vaccinated, and this has a list of vaccine reactions. So let's save that to a board. We're just going to save that pin. We're not following anybody. But what we notice is after we do that, we have a lot of new stuff on our homepage here. And a lot of it's pretty scary about vaccines. And when we refresh it, it doesn't go away. Like embedded right there in the middle of a new couscous recipe is some stuff about autism. So we save our second pin. Our second pin is about autism. It's one of only 2 pins that we're going to save during this whole process. And you start to see what's happened already. Just by saving 2 pins, never explicitly asking for this stuff. Saving 2 pins, we're getting fluoride, conspiracy theories. We're getting stuff about GMO. We're branching out into like major medical conspiracies. And it gets even worse because one thing you might think is you start to see that it's getting pretty bad here. But what we might do is we might go and we might visit some of these pages. So we go and we visit a page to check and see if it's legitimate. It gets worse. Pinterest actually regards that visiting the page as a sign of real interest in vaccination conspiracies. So when we come back to our page, so when we come back to our front page, here's what it's like after we visit the page, right? You're starting to get to a point where the front page is almost all medical conspiracy. And again, this happens in the space of from signing up to about 14 minutes into having the Pinterest account. This is where we are. And I mean, look at this page. It's kind of amazing.
So in the case of Pinterest, a lot of designers I know use Pinterest, and for a long time I did too. And what's interesting, this is an example, an extreme example, in which Tradeoff Conflict actually produces a particular outcome, right? And the trade-off conflict is really simple in this case. This is where the trade-off of trying to understand how people click on things in an interface can be turned into a very, very simple, flattened concept. One click equals interest, right? When I click on something within Pinterest, I'm interested in it, and thusly I want more of it. And the trade-off is every other way or reason why I would click something is ignored or interpreted in a single way. And so what you have is this issue. This is an extreme case where the algorithm behind Pinterest is poisoned by the interface, straight up through this kind of this trade-off. And what's interesting and why this is so amazing in terms of design is that if you extrapolate from this particular piece, you start to wonder things like, if you use Pinterest as a mood board, as a graphic designer, what are some of the ways in which Pinterest might be biasing you on a more subtle level? I mean, this is an extreme example, but what about the more subtle level where Pinterest is actually, through you clicking and exploring for your clients or for aesthetics that you're interested in or examples of work that you're interested in, what is it? How is your practice being manipulated behind the scenes by this firm, right? By this algorithm? And if you extend that even further, you could say, what about your actual work itself? How much of it is actually owned by you if you are being influenced, or if your work is being refined through an algorithm? Does that mean that in the future, a company like Pinterest can have some kind of claim over some of your work or the development of your aesthetics based on what it chose to show you, it's a really difficult discussion to have, but it's also extremely subtle. It takes these absurd examples to show you, to highlight sort of the problematic ways in which algorithms work, especially when a complicated algorithm uses these kinds of trade-offs through the design team to produce these simple versions of them. So I only have a few minutes left, and I want to start wrapping up and through some simple ways in which we can start to question and confront these interfaces, right? And confront this problem. It's a little bit blasé at this point, but to say you must start through demanding better design. And this is true not just of the interfaces, but the infrastructure behind it, right? The first way, of course, is that we should start designing for politics, not personas. And if you don't know what a persona is, it's this idea where it's almost like a focus group, the market research version of a focus group. And this is where designers take the requirements of the business and some of the users that they want to make and that want to design for, and they create personas that is fictionalized versions of these users based on the requirements that they have. And usually what you do is you put them into groups, and it's made up of a fictionalized biography, the kind of devices that they use, whether they have digital literacy or not, what their socioeconomic status is or not, whatever you need to make some sets of design decisions with your project. And then from there, you combine them with this concept of user stories, which is where you take some of the tasks that your personas may want to carry out, and you start to turn them into tasks that are broken down into discrete actions. As a consumer, I would like to buy a thing so I can send it to my family. And in these cases, personas mixed with user stories allow you to create, allow you to design at scale, right? A lot of systems that we build are quite complicated, and also complicated from a perspective of actual execution, not just the conceptual level. And so these tools help you create an understanding between multiple different teams and create consensus. But the problem is, as we saw before, is that these are tools that rely upon this idea of a flattened cultural context. And indeed, the role of the user story is to erase all interpersonal relationships. In so many cases, this kind of work doesn't actually explore the relationship between different people, the understanding of you and the individual and their device, or even if the individual is using the device or someone else is acting on their behalf, or the relationship between the state and your app or your project and the device, or all of these sort of interpersonal socio-political components of this larger system. Instead, these focus on depoliticized individuals with their relationships unexplored, in taking actions that are depoliticized in a lot of cases, and where the actions, the relationships around these actions are also unexplored. But of course, there are companies that do this already. There are tools that you can use in design to actually do this. Of course, graphic design has a huge background in this. The history of graphic design is literally about this. But beyond that, looking through to software, massive multiplayer online games are a great example of people who take complex relationships and import them into, like, use them as part of the design making process. This is a screenshot of a game called Eve Online. And what's interesting about Eve is that the company that makes it, CCP, are a group that, through the very nature of Eve, which has a strong user base that has a lot of, what's the term I'm looking for? The user base is deeply political. There's a lot of back channeling in the behind the scenes with the outside of the game through offline and online communication. And there's real alliances that are formed between massive groups of up to hundreds or even sometimes thousands of players. And so this kind of political context is deeply interwoven in this game. But it's not the only example. There are others, such as World of Warcraft, in which people form lifelong friendships with each other through playing World of Warcraft. And in each of these cases, the design teams are really embracing the role of relationships as part of the design making process. And this is called participatory design. And the idea that you take these and start to incorporate some of this work into a body of graphic design work, that can lead to, I think, a better outcome. So a question that would come back here: what do I believe is the ethical role of the artist today? Does the ethical boundary expand? Does this ethical boundary expand, or do I think that designers are not aware of that? Well, I think that I can kind of get into that a little bit. I think that ethics is the wrong way to look at it in some contexts. I mean, ethics, of course, is a large part of dark UX patterns. But outside of that, in a lot of weaponized design, the main thrust behind it is that people don't actually understand the issues that they're creating. It's things like unintended consequences, where you build something and someone uses it in a way that you didn't anticipate, or that you build something and it amplifies an existing social problem, right? And so these are core problems that a design team, through whatever method, whether it's consciously embracing a kind of thing, or whether it's through apathy, or through making these trade-offs, they're not aware of that. And in many cases, this is not necessarily an ethical issue. It's more of this idea of the life experiences of design teams not being, and the design industry itself being rooted in specific political cultures that prevent it from seeing the broader lived experiences of their users. But I can sort of talk a little bit more about this question in a second. Actually, I will jump forward. So one of the ways in which we can do this is to confront design outcomes. And where we have a code of conduct in open source communities and things like that, it's not enough, I don't think, to have a code of conduct, right? Like, code of conducts only go so far. They allow you to see that they allow people to agree upon a certain set of behaviors that you really want people to have when they interact within your open source project or your conference or your space, and even within communities. That's beginning to happen now. And these sorts of systems help people understand what the minimum level of behavior needs to be within a team, right? But the thing is that even when we have this idea of core values and conduct, we're not actually. We still have these problems, right? Where there's, even in groups like Slack, or companies like Slack, or this sort of push within Silicon Valley, it's not enough to just try to solve all these issues within a design team. So if I bounce backwards again for a second, I can tell you a little bit about this. This is the idea of designing for the worst case scenario, right? So where you have diversity and things like that, even within that field, because design comes from, interface design in particular, comes from these particular structures, of which it's now beginning to influence a lot of the arts. I mean, I use the example of Pinterest, but there's other examples too, like even how the interfaces that we use to build architecture is beginning to change how architecture is seen, or how, sorry, not how it's seen, how it's executed. Or product design is having these same kinds of things, where you have an industrial designer. Traditionally, they would have worked in a variety of mediums in order to produce a piece of industrial design. Now, the interface can actually influence the way in which these items are built. That's something that you could do an entire talk on. But aside from that, if we extract it to a base level or to a commonality, we really need to start designing for the worst case scenario. A great example of this, I feel, is like in this work with security researchers, right? But it's not the only example. So in this case, you have two groups of people: a design team, which makes great UX to keep people in, and a security team that makes terrible UX to keep people or attackers out of the system. And indeed, the role of a security team is, in fact, to make UX so terrible that the people who are going to attack your system try to, basically, you want to discourage them and make them move on. And so these teams have a responsibility to explore different ways in which people can get into a system. And there are tools that each team uses, both frictionless design, but also these ideas of threat modeling, or other sorts of understandings of the roles of infrastructure, and also the motivations of people and their relationships to people. Social engineering, as an example, this idea of pretending to be someone you're not in order to get access, like a password, out of somebody and get into an account. These sorts of things are the responsibilities. And so the idea that you would pair together, it actually makes a lot of sense. It's two groups of people doing the same thing from the opposite sides. I mean, this is beyond the idea of just bringing more people in or diversifying and decolonizing design in general. There's also all of these other fields in which design, knowingly and willingly meeting and consulting with and incorporating these, we can start to go some way towards fixing this issue. And then, of course, you kind of see this online already. This is an example. This is an application called Sync. It uses a decentralized model to sync between multiple devices, kind of like a decentralized Dropbox. And the way that you share very secure information across this network, like shares or folders or something like that, is you use QR codes. And this is a frictionless way of sharing information, sharing these folders without actually ever needing to type something in or otherwise struggle with an interface. But it is a cooperation between a design team and a security team that leads to something like this. And indeed, in some of the early work I showed off around Web of Trust and working with Carnegie Mellon and cryptographers at SpiderOak, this is the kind of work that we did here too, where you could sign on, you could provision new devices to an account that you owned through having that account open on one machine and authenticating it through the camera with the new device that you wanted to add. To come back to confronting design outcomes, ultimately, I think what we need is we need to confront design outcomes. And what we need, if we come back to the concept of the code of conduct, is perhaps we need a code of outcomes. This idea that we not just look at how people behave or how we agree to behave within an organization, but also critique the ways in which design that we do is put out into the world and then used. And through that understanding of what we expect the minimum outcome to be and what we think is acceptable and what we think is problematic, by beginning to write that kind of content and write that kind of guidance for ourselves as design teams, that can be the starting point for an actual way of confronting design. So an example of this would be tied to question 2, right? And that is, the question is, how does weaponized design affect the broader cultural aspect? So one of the ways in which we see this, of course, is through, like, the lazy way of looking at this is like the concept of fake news, right? Where because every voice is amplified with equal importance, it leads to stuff bubbling to the surface that can then use algorithms to basically push itself further. It's sort of automated distribution of fringe ideas, right? And of course, the internet being a great equalizer is super important. But the role of this is a lot more problematic, right? When you consider the 1-2 punch of how this works. So if we take two sets of activities that happened at the same time, or one after the other, but like immediately after each other. The first one was, if people remember, the clickbait headlines of things like the New York Times and other reputable institutes, right? This idea that you had big media organizations who went from publishing long-form, thoughtful pieces to either video content on the encouragement of the fraudulent, I think, encouragement of Facebook, based on the news that we've seen recently about Facebook sort of fibbing around their numbers of video. Either that or this idea of clickbait, where through the execution of articles being shared virally around the web, the easiest way to generate advertising revenue would be to write a clickbait article and then bring that to use that to push a piece of content around the web. And so what that led to over time is this distrust of the media, right? The most famous cases being things like BuzzFeed, which had a very strong journalistic arm to it, but at the same time is kind of ridiculed for its obsession with hot takes and top 10 lists and this really simplified, buzzy content. And it embraced that unashamedly at the expense, I believe, of its unbelievably good journalist work. But to connect that to today, what you have is, alongside this floating of information to the surface of like fringe beliefs, you also have the erosion of trust within these media organizations and outside of the political context of people in positions of power, decrying the legitimacy of these kinds of institutions. A lot of this damage has been done through these systems that have been set up, these frictionless systems of sharing content that encouraged this oversimplification, or in some cases, fictionalization in some cases, or like the idea of articles becoming highly scandalous, or the idea of sharing unverified photography that turns out to be faked. All of these kinds of things. This is an example, a more systemic example of how different parts of a weaponized design system, different parts of a system can be weaponized together through its design. And in the case of this is everything from algorithms allowing stuff to bubble to the surface, combined with the execution of news articles and their presentation within a broader news feed, and then the algorithmic timeline. All of these come together in a particular way, and you can pick and choose them and then turn them into this this toolbox that you use to push an agenda whilst also delegitimizing existing forms of media. And a problem with that, of course, is that the idea historically was that these institutions had this kind of editorial rigor that would allow them to be trustworthy. And by sort of pushing this kind of interface and forcing this content through that interface, you destabilize or otherwise undermine that concept or the trustworthiness of those organizations. And the third question is, what is your advice for the designers that work for big commercial companies? How do you as an individual confront the issue of weaponized design? So I'm glad you asked. I don't know if I have all the answers in this context. I think that the idea of this particular talk is to start a broader discussion with designers. I don't believe that the answers are very simple. There are many ways in which we could do this. I think the code of outcomes is a great idea. Another example would be unionization, perhaps, like the idea that a group of designers can work together to unionize and push back on problematic concepts such as key performance indicators around attention or engagement. I think that trying to antagonize to move away from engagement as being the metric of which a design team is measured is deeply important in order for this to be successful, in order for us to break this. But of course, I also think that we need to bring this work to the new generation of designers. We need to explore the concepts of weaponized design with people who are still in design school, because this is often the first examples of socio and political implication of work, of design for some of these individuals. In a lot of cases, computer design is completely apolitical, or apolitical from a sense in which the politics are not openly discussed. And that is the deeply problematic part. That has led to an entire generation of designers working within this context where politics doesn't even enter into their work. They might be highly political people and otherwise politically engaged, but the work itself that they produce isn't questioned in the same way as they might question other things. I want to jump to a quote and then see if there are any more questions. This is ironically from Donald Norman. When people fail to follow these bizarre secret rules and the machine does the wrong thing, ironically, coincidentally, by Donald Norman. When people fail to follow these bizarre secret rules and the machine does the wrong thing, its operators are blamed for not understanding the machine and for not following its rigid specifications. With everyday objects, the result is frustration. With complex devices and commercial and industrial processes, the resulting difficulties can lead to accidents, injuries, and even deaths. It is time to reverse the situation, to cast the blame upon the machines and their design. It is the machine and its design that are at fault. It is the duty of machines and those who design them to understand people. It is not our duty to understand the arbitrary, meaningless dictates of the machine. I've got a piece here that I wrote. It was originally published with Tactical Tech, but this URL is shorter. I have another question here too. In the context of my talk today, how do I see the future of design? I think we're definitely at a crossroads. We have this issue where people are beginning to figure out that there's systemic issues with platforms, especially through things like platform surveillance, or surveillance capitalism, the idea of trading privacy for subsidized access to devices and services. I think that oftentimes there's a discussion that happens purely within the middle class, or what remains of the middle class, that is based around certain kinds of design. I mean, one of the reasons why I give this talk, even though the examples I give are, for the most part, a little bit more banal than some of the terrifying consequences of weaponized design, such as genocide in foreign countries and things like that, is to show that it starts with banality. It starts with small problematic things that affect individuals in very serious ways, even in countries potentially that are considered stable. And then that rolls out and grows and sort of destabilizes based on your level of precariousness, whether you live in poverty or under a police state or even under surveillance in places like the United States or in Europe. And beyond that, in countries that are less stable around political elections or political minorities or ethnic minorities and things like that. And so I think we're at a crossroads where people are beginning to see the relationships between sort of deeply violent activities that are fueled through Facebook, and then the ways in which that can be connected into their own lives. What we lack is this lexicon for understanding how the role in which design plays, that is the interface and the infrastructure plays in producing these outcomes. And so the future of design has to embrace this idea that design is an inherently political thing. And indeed, it's an inherently capitalistic endeavor. This idea that design, as it stands today, reinforces certain kinds of power structures. And the fact that the Silicon Valley mindset of disruption, in fact, didn't really disrupt, but actually was a simple transfer of power and an amplification of existing social structures through monolithic organizations. Without design, none of this is possible. If Facebook had terrible design, it would never be used by anybody. And so designers have to start to come to grips with this role that they play. And so in the future of design, I think that unless we start to deal with these issues ourselves, there are going to be deeper and deeper pushes to regulate the internet. A great example of some of the early sorts of things that we can look to are things like the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which covers everything from tracking people on the web and consent to that, or consent to the existing surveillance capitalist structures, all the way through to the right to object to algorithmic decision making, for example. And so these tools, while they're not perfect, are like the first step of a greater set of regulation that will fragment the internet into these weird silos over time. And so if we don't want to do that, we need to embrace a level of self-regulation, which has to start with design advocacy, right? Designers are the advocates of the users, and we have to start advocating for our users. And yes, it's going to be difficult because a lot of these things rely on both designers becoming more politically critical of their own work, and also that there will be a lot of pushback from people external to that system. And so the idea is to try to build this lexicon that we can actually start designing for these things, discussing these things, and pushing back on these things. As I said here, this is the essay that I produced. If we have any more questions, I'll take them. But otherwise, this has been a real pleasure, and thank you very much. Usually there's more questions, but there's a live stream. The questions sort of come very slowly and things like that. So thank you for that question, Ivana. That was really great. Just trying to run. Cool. Can artworks from traditional art be the weapon? So, can artworks from traditional art be the weapon? I think so. I think that the question's a little bit broad, and there's probably multiple ways in which you can interpret it. So I'll say how I'm interpreting it is: can you take well, okay, here's a question for you. Can artworks from traditional art be the weapon? Do you mean like the digitization of traditional art as a form of weaponization, or something else? Like, there's multiple ways of looking at this. One of which would be through digitizing certain pieces of art, you can then use that within a weaponized context. I would say that if that's the interpretation of that question, then the answer would be potentially. I think that the big equalizer in this case is the concept of memeing, right? And how memeing can borrow from a variety of different sources And in the last few years, we've seen how memes have gone from just internet culture to really serious radicalization or tools of radicalization, and also the spread of particular ideals. And this is, memeing itself is not inherently a problem, but it is a symptom of a particular system that's been built. And so that memes can be completely banal or funny or asinine, doesn't really matter. But then they can have these insanely powerful, sometimes dangerous messages. And so where the weaponization comes into this is you can take traditional art, co-opt it, and then produce memes from that context. That would be one way. I'd be interested in hearing from someone if I misinterpreted that question. I'd be interested in hearing from someone around that. It's a seriously interesting question. Can artworks from traditional art be the weapon? Because it really does, in terms of weaponized design, it really is the marriage of infrastructure with art. And the art in this case is the art of interface design, that is the aesthetics, branding, user research, all of this kind of stuff. And so it really needs a cooperation of several components in order for that to be weaponized. I think the closest that you could get to maybe is the role of infrastructure, say, for example, car infrastructure. Now, this isn't quite the question, but like the idea, for example, I'm trying to think of some concrete examples, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but an example would be building highways of certain levels in order to building overpasses at certain heights in order to discourage certain groups of people from traveling to certain areas, which is a way of weaponizing infrastructure. And then also you design different vehicles at different heights, such as buses at certain heights and cars at certain heights. And you also encourage a car culture at the same time in order to produce hierarchy and class and stuff like that. But I mean, this is not exactly traditional art, but it sort of, again, borrows from these kinds of concepts. So you have a lot of, I think it really, traditional art would be a particular component in a broader sense of that. Design historically, and indeed interface design, has a long history of incorporating, like, being basically acting through, how do I describe this? There's a deeply colonial aspect to design, and this extends directly into interface design, where it borrows components from that. But I don't know how traditional art, I can't think of an example right now of how traditional art itself could be the weaponized part. Maybe if there was some kind of IoT sculptures, maybe something like that. It's an interesting thing. I'm just thinking about it right now, and it's a super interesting question. But again, like, it comes down to the cooperation of infrastructure with art. Cool. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for coming and listening to this, either in real time or after the fact. That was my first stream too, so I'm sorry if it was a bit rough. It was quite difficult. I'm on Twitter and then my website. This is what's in the background right now. It's great to, if anyone reached out to me and talked to me about it. I'm sort of interested in hearing from a lot of perspectives, been giving the Weaponized Design talk in a lot of contexts and hearing a lot of really fascinating things. The essay itself, which I'll go back to right now, has a series of components to it, and a long reading list as well. Let me move my stupid face out of the way so you can actually read the whole thing. So if you bounce to my website, you can sort of read the essay, and from there go on to the resources or the references. It was a fascinating piece to put together, and I'm really proud of it. It's the first of a series of essays that I'm working on. The others are coming maybe at the end of this year and then on to next year. But either way, this is the first time I've given this particular talk to a group of designers who work outside of infrastructure and work predominantly in graphic design. So thank you very much. Thank you to the team for organizing this. It was really amazing. And I'm going to dive through and watch all the other talks and things like that. And yeah, I'll see you on the internet. Thanks.